without more ado, let me introduce our two speakers this evening, Lucy Johnstone and Mary Boyle. Lucy Johnstone is a consultant clinical psychologist with many years' experience in NHS mental health services. She now works independently. She's the author of several books, including a straight-talking introduction to psychiatric diagnosis, and with Mary Boyle, another straight-talking introduction to the power, threat, meaning framework, a pile of which is over there on my desk. So if you'd like to buy a copy, leave it till the very end of the session. Mary Boyle is also a clinical psychologist and is Professor Emerita at UEL, and apart from the book I've just mentioned, is the author of Schizophrenia, a Scientific Delusion from 2002. And as an indication of the growing interest in their work among philosophers, it was the subject of discussions in not one but two recent issues of Philosophy, Psychiatry and Psychology, the journal. Their talk this evening is entitled The Power, Threat, Meaning Framework, an Alternative to Psychiatric Diagnosis. Lucy and Mary, over to you.
Okay, well, I am going to talk about the Power, Threat, Meaning Framework, but first of all, I'm going to give you some background about why it was developed and why it took the form that it did. And I think quite a good starting point for doing that is philosophy's important role in helping us to see and perhaps to question some of the assumptions behind what we might take for granted about ourselves and about the world. And certainly the ideas we're presenting this evening do question some common assumptions about what we call mental health. And we hope that that will encourage constructive discussion and debate. Now, one way of clarifying our assumptions is by looking at language. And that's bearing in mind that language isn't just about the words we use, but about the effects of those words. And the US writer Toni Morrison put this very well when she said that language is an act, something we do with consequences. So what's the common language of mental distress, of our most troubling thoughts and feelings and behaviour? Well, this is some of the language that's very commonly used. It's clearly the language of medicine, so an immediate consequence or effect is to suggest that our emotional and behavioural difficulties can be understood in the same way as malfunctioning body parts. Now, this in turn can create a sense of something called mental disorders as separate, universal things that seem to have a life of their own, quite independent of any personal, social, or historical context. Now, this is also reflected in language. So, for example, people are said to have a mental disorder as if it's a bodily possession. And also, mental illness happens to us. It is often said it can happen to anyone. It develops in us, it affects us, it causes us to think, feel, and behave in certain ways. And these disorders can even cause each other. This is a quote from a clinician in a media article about a woman who was very distressed after the birth of her child. And you can see these disorders just go kind of round and round. Now, one of the things about this language is that it portrays us rather like objects who are passively acted on by impersonal forces, rather than as people responding actively and meaningfully to their difficult lives. Now, another important effect of this language is to give credibility to certain practices. For example, researching mental disorders separately from people's life experience. So looking for causes in people's genes and biology. Now, the scale of this research far outweighs research looking for causes in the conditions of people's lives. That's especially for more serious diagnoses like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. And that search goes on with the goal of diagnosing mental disorders through biological measures. That is, more or less independently of our life experiences. If you just have a look at these quotes. Now, I think you'll agree that these quotes conjure a future where the essence of a mental disorder can in effect be removed from the person and identified perhaps by a scanner or a microscope or something like that. And those are typical, actually. They're not so highly selected. And consistent with all this, there's the practice of depicting mental disorders as specific targets for treatment, for example, by antidepressants, antipsychotics, or anxiolytics. Now, all of this doesn't mean that people's subjective or life experiences are ignored, but it does mean that it can be very difficult to integrate them in any meaningful way with the very powerful idea of separate, independent, biologically based mental disorders. And how that plays out in services, for example. People are often told that certain life events, and I quote, are just a trigger for their underlying biological vulnerability to mental disorder. Or there might just be a narrow focus on getting the right diagnosis, on medication, on what's called symptom management or relapse prevention. Now, the thing about the assumptions and practices that I've been talking about, they have very deep philosophical roots, and that helps account for their power and their persistence. I'll outline very briefly some of the more recent roots. The first is in the European Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries. Now, that proposed individual reason, observation, and sense evidence as the route to reliable knowledge. Now, that was instead of the authority of church or state. And these ideas both reflected and also supported scientific advances of the time in astronomy, in physics, chemistry, and biology. And then later in the 19th century, these scientific advances encouraged some philosophers to recommend applying the methods of natural sciences to the study of human and social affairs. And this formed part of a highly influential set of ideas, which was named by Auguste Comte as positivism. Now, Comte focused on modelling sociology on the natural sciences, but the fledgling disciplines of psychology and psychiatry were also very early adopters of positivism in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And that was largely because natural science methods not only promised progress, as in the other sciences, but also status and credibility. And for the so-called mad doctors of the time, there was the added bonus of seeming to support their claim that abnormal behavior and emotions could be studied using the same progressive ways as abnormal body organs. Now, questioning these Enlightenment or positive ideas isn't to dismiss them, but if you apply them wholesale to understanding human affairs, they do have serious limitations. And the most relevant here is this series of separations that they have helped to embed in the Western worldview, and very specifically in psychology and psychiatry. So, for example, you have separation between researcher and researched, and the researched, i.e. those with mental disorders in here, become the objects of study. Now, that might work if you're studying actual objects, but when it's one group of humans studying another group of humans, it's a bit more problematic. And then the separation of fact and value through the idea of objectivity, which is strongly linked to numbers and measurement. Then the separation of thought or reason or intellect and emotion. I'll come back to that one. And then the separation of ourselves, each of us, and each other. So seeing us as autonomous individuals with characteristics such as personalities or attitudes or cognitive styles, and of course mental disorders that can explain our behaviour. And finally, a separation of our biology, our psyche, and the social and natural world. And in one way and another, these separations are reflected in the language, the assumptions, and the practices that I've just been describing. And that leads to yet another set of consequences that we need to consider. The first consequence comes from the fact that the search for biological causes, for separate biological causes or biomarkers of what are said to be mental disorders, has not been successful. That's putting it mildly. But the idea of medical type mental illnesses has been retained. And because of that, then diagnoses are based on subjective judgments and social norms. So whether someone's thoughts or feelings or behaviour are expected or normal in their culture. Now, who should decide this? Or let me take a few examples of diagnostic criteria. Who should decide whether your anger is inappropriate, or your guilt is excessive, or your beliefs are bizarre, or even, believe it or not, that your sexual fantasies are deficient? And what happens when cultural expectations change or vary? Well, as you'd expect, there is a lot of disagreement about these diagnostic judgments, and there is no independent way of settling them. And following from that, diagnoses don't tell us about the causes of distress, but unfortunately, they're often presented as if they did. And then there's the issue of outcomes. Some people do find a medical and a diagnostic approach helpful, but the wider picture is not encouraging. And this is Thomas Insel talking about his recent tenure as head of the United States National Institute of Mental Health. And if you just read that quote. I think you'll agree this is a rather depressing picture, but it's also very accurate. He's not underplaying it. And it's repeated across many Western countries, and probably leaves you wondering if that $20 billion might not have been better spent. Now, finally, the language and assumptions of mental disorders can create imbalances of power, where researchers and professionals are seen as the knowledgeable experts, while service users and carers can really struggle to have their voices heard, especially if they don't find a diagnostic approach helpful. And this point has been highlighted by a recent United Nations report. And as you see, they're calling for policies that address the power imbalance rather than chemical imbalance. Now, this power imbalance, it links us back to the Enlightenment ideas I mentioned earlier, especially the privileging of reason and objectivity as the route to knowledge. Because the ability to reason was seen as unequally distributed. White European men had most, women, children, and non-white people had less, and of course those said to be mad had least of all. Emotion, on the other hand, was seen as very plentiful in these groups, but that was a barrier to objectivity and knowledge, even about yourself. And in one way or another, these perceptions, which are rooted in the separation of reason and emotion, fact and value, researcher and researched, still persist. And one outcome is what the philosopher Miranda Fricker has called testimonial injustice, where the views of some groups about themselves and about the world are systematically overlooked, ignored, denigrated, or just devalued. And one example of this is the hierarchy of evidence, and I'm quoting there, hierarchy of evidence in evaluating drugs and therapies for mental health problems. And their findings based on numbers, on measurements, and on statistics produced by the researchers are given very high status, while the views of those actually receiving the drugs or therapies might be downgraded to anecdote or opinion. And again, that's quoting from their documents. So these kinds of problems and many others have led to calls for alternative ways of not just talking about our emotional and behavioural problems, but thinking about them and responding to them. And that brings me to the power threat meaning framework, which is our possible alternative. And one of the aims was to reconnect some of these separations that I've been talking about. And this alternative to psychiatric diagnosis and its underlying assumptions, it was developed by a group of psychologists and service users with a wider reference group. It was funded by the British Psychological Society's Division of Clinical Psychology, but it's not an official model. Instead, it's an optional set of ideas and conceptual resources that anyone can draw on if they find it helpful. It offers an overall framework. It's not a therapy manual or a guide to therapy, but it offers a wide overall framework which can support, it can enhance many non-diagnostic approaches, but it also suggests some new ways forward. Now, our starting point for the framework was that what we call mental health problems are not illnesses like any other. They're not diagnosable. Instead, they are understandable and meaningful responses to a person's history and circumstances, although, as Lucy will show, the links may not be obvious or straightforward. And the framework, we hope, offers a way of understanding people in their relational, their social, and political environments. It's about all of us, not just those given diagnostic labels. So it doesn't recognise any separate group of the mentally ill. Now, Lucy will give a lot more detail about it, but the basic structure of the framework can be conveyed in these 4 questions. So instead of asking what's wrong with you or what disorder do you have, the framework asks what has happened to you, but then expands that to how is power operating in your life. In other words, it's really asking what systems, what structures, what misuse or abuse of power might be involved in what's happened to you. And then how did it affect you? What kinds of threats, what kinds of challenges, adversities, traumas does this pose for you? And then what sense did you make of it? What is the meaning of these experiences to you? And finally, what did you have to do to survive? What kinds of threat responses are you using? And it's these threat responses that are so often labelled as psychiatric symptoms, and potentially they have their meaningfulness obscured, as well as the power and meaning processes that have shaped their development. So there are 2 further questions. First, what are your strengths? Now, we don't see strengths as some kind of inner quality like resilience or self-confidence or self-esteem, though they may be labelled in that way. Instead, the question we ask is, what access to power resources do you have? Because therein lies your strengths. And those are some examples, just some, of the access to power resources people might have or can be helped by others to achieve. And then, to integrate everything, what is your story? And so the aim of all of this is to help individuals or groups or communities even to create new, non-pathological, and we hope more hopeful stories and narratives about themselves and their lives. And this perspective allows us to see much more clearly the connections between mental suffering, social inequalities, and social injustice. It also allows us to see a different role for biology from the chemical imbalances or brain disorders that are proposed within a medicalised approach. And more widely, one of our major aims in developing the framework is to show that the more we understand the connections between what happens to us in our lives and the meaningful ways we respond, then the less we need to invent mental disorders as an explanation. So I'll hand over to Lucy now, who'll give you a lot more detail and fill in some big gaps in that. Thank you.
Thank you. Great. So Mary's outlined the principles of the framework very clearly. I'm now going to describe in a little bit more detail what those principles look like when translated into the framework, which is our best attempt to say what might this look like in practice, what do we need to do differently. And essentially, as you've already gathered, I'm sure we are saying we need to move away from the diagnostic model, which is unevidenced, which is not only unhelpful for many people, although not all, but can be very often actually damaging, towards an approach that is based on narratives, not diagnoses. And as Mary's already said, this is not simply about services, about professionals, about people who are officially labelled as mentally ill or disordered. We are all storytellers and meaning makers. We all struggle with difficulties in our lives. We all try to make sense of things. We all try to put together our own understanding so that we can find a way forward when life gets difficult. So I'm going to briefly go through the questions that Mary's just outlined. And please don't feel you have to read every word on the slide. I mean, you can have the slides afterwards. I don't know if they usually get circulated, but we're very happy for you to have the slides. But I'm going to start with the first and perhaps in some ways the most important question, because everything follows from this. What has happened to you? Or in other words, how is power operating in your life? I do want to emphasise this shouldn't be understood too kind of literally or kind of rigidly. So these questions are, well, they're optional. The whole framework is optional. It's a set of optional ideas. No one has to like it, read it, implement it, or do anything with it. The questions are kind of overlapping. It's almost impossible to talk about power without implying threat. It's almost impossible to talk about threat without verging on meaning, and so on. And the questions are adaptable. So if this particular vocabulary doesn't make sense to you or someone you're working with or supporting, we very much hope people will kind of choose different vocabulary. And finally, this is not a process of going in a linear way through what has happened to you, what threats response does it result in, and so on. Almost certainly when you construct a story, you want to start almost anywhere, actually. These are overlapping questions. You want to come back to it. It'll be a recursive process. Stories develop over a whole lifetimes, in fact. So there is never an end to a story. Nevertheless, we wanted to suggest this as a rough structure, and we wanted to be very sure that we considered all the forms of power that may be operating in someone's life. So we've got a list there. Again, these are overlapping forms of power, which I won't go through one by one, but I will explain to you why we thought this was so important. And really, it's because power is everywhere in our lives, and yet a consideration of power in all its various forms is missing by definition from diagnostic understandings. They screen out just about every possible form of power because they imply very explicitly that the so-called disorder has arisen within the individual. Somewhere the cause is inside you, or perhaps even within your brain chemistry. And it's not just psychiatry that does that. Many versions of psychology and psychotherapy do the same. So it's not just about psychiatry gets it wrong, it's about the many ways that we can miss out the impact of power. And yet, we know this. These are well-established facts. All the major causes of what we might call mental health problems involve inequalities of power, as you can see there. So the very long and dense PTMF main documents are a massive summary of all the evidence that supports that statement. So you wouldn't think this was true from the way we talk about so-called mental health problems. You certainly wouldn't think so from the research programmes. For example, the government has recently promised £650 million for its new life sciences vision, which is going to investigate biomarkers and new drugs to treat what they are still calling mental disorders. It seems to me that's a pretty catastrophic waste of money, and that money would go very much more appropriately towards what we already know and know very, very well and have had demonstrated many, many times about the roots of distress. We need to put into practice what we know before we start hypothesising about what might be wrong in your brain chemistry. That means you don't enjoy being poor and abused and discriminated against and so on. So I want to talk a little bit about ideological power, one particular form of power that is both important and hard to identify. So roughly this means things like our worldviews, our assumptions, the things we tend to, without questioning perhaps, take as normal or desirable or perhaps undesirable and to be avoided. And very often these ideological power is shaped by the use of language, which is often used so that more powerful and privileged groups can implement policies and behave in certain ways and so on, which are to act to the disadvantage of less powerful groups. So we see this at an individual level in a way. We see all sorts of messages. For example, that people who might be raped or living in poverty are in some senses responsible for their fates. These messages are all around us. We also see it when we label the consequences of trauma or adversity as it's because you are psychotic or personality disordered or mentally ill. And at a systemic level, and this is not intended as a criticism of any staff who are hard-working people working under very difficult situations, often underpaid and undervalued, but at a systemic level, we would argue that the mental health and the criminal justice system are often effectively used to turn social problems into individual ones by defining people as mad or bad. And we see the imposition of a psychiatric diagnosis as though it's a form of fact, as though it is a fact that you, let's say, have bipolar disorder or have schizophrenia or have clinical depression, when it isn't a fact, as an act of injustice, epistemic injustice. It's not a form of injustice we're used to thinking about, but it's imposing a particular and a powerful form of reality which has many consequences, many of them adverse, in a way that we think is completely unjustifiable. So, how did it affect you? I won't go through this in any detail because, as I said, it automatically follows on from a consideration of power that numerous areas of your life may be placed under threat, including your relationships, your ability to manage your emotions, your role in the community, your bodily integrity and safety, and so on. And perhaps more subtly, as I've just described, there may be threats to your beliefs and basic values and your ability and your need, really, to make your own meanings about your life. The third question, what sense did you make of it? This is at the heart of any kind of therapy endeavour. If any of you in the audience are therapists, all therapies are a sense, a form of meaning-making. But we wanted to take meaning a bit further than the ways it's sometimes understood, which again can be quite individualistic, as though meaning somehow arise spontaneously within our own heads. Whereas we are strongly arguing that the meanings that we create about our experiences come from somewhere. They come from the messages all around us, the assumptions in any given society about what it is to be a good mother, a happy family, a refugee, and so on, which in their turn may well be shaped by ideological meanings. So one of the examples I often give at this point is that I've worked with probably several hundred women survivors of rape and sexual abuse over the course of my career, each and every one of whom came along with a very, often having not disclosed these events at all, with a very strongly individually held sense of shame, and it was my fault and I was to blame and I should have done this and I shouldn't have done that and so on. And it's impossible really to see that number of people with these unshared but remarkably similar beliefs without starting to ask, well, where do those beliefs come from? And of course they come from wider messages in society about women, about men, about responsibility for behaviour and so on, which you could argue are actually at one level ideologically driven, so that it may be quite suitable to certain power interests to persuade women in this case, but there are parallel examples for men that somehow it is their fault. And we don't have to acknowledge the very widespread impact of routine sexual violence in women's and girls' lives. What did you have to do to survive? As we've already said, this covers the territory of what we might call symptoms in psychiatric terms. A lot of this part of the framework draws on the trauma-informed literature, which some of you may be familiar with, the very large body of literature that shows beyond any possible doubt that things like traumas and adversities of all kinds in people's lives, particularly in their early lives, make it more likely that they will experience distress. It's kind of common sense in a way, or in psychiatric terms, disorders. So in thinking about threat responses, we of course include the role of the body. Our minds and our bodies work together to react to help us to survive threats. But we're not thinking about the role of the body in a simplistic causal sense. Your low serotonin level caused your depression. We are thinking about the role of the body as an enabler and mediator of all human experience. And threat responses serve a function. Survival responses is another way of describing them. So rather than an attempt to somehow damp them down or knock them out, although for some short-term purposes that may be useful, the ultimate aim really is to respect them because they were needed, they serve a function, they help us to survive in very difficult circumstances. So very simple example of that. A woman who comes out of a domestically violent relationship may spend a long time in a sense of high vigilance and alert and what could be called an anxiety disorder or something like that. That way of being actually makes sense in dangerous situations. The problem comes when the threat response is employed long after it may be needed and becomes problematic in its own right. So here's some example of threat responses, with the ones at the top more bodily based, if you like, experienced as less under our conscious control, and the ones at the bottom not necessarily seen as symptoms because they are socially valued. Overwork and perfectionism, for example, are very much promoted in our society. So anyone like me who demonstrates those is unlikely to be held down and medicated and diagnosed, but nevertheless, these can also be kind of less than constructive ways of reacting to the world over the long term. So restoring the links between threats and threat responses, a core aim of the framework, or to put the same thing in a different way, restoring the link between personal distress and social injustice. And it's our argument that psychiatric practice, and a lot of psychological practice too, obscures the links between threats and threat responses by imposing a diagnosis and then treating an illness. And this has always seemed a very curious thing to me as a long-term practitioner, because it's kind of common sense at one level. For example, if you asked anyone in the street, do you think people living in poverty are more likely to feel miserable and desperate? They would say, well, yes, I imagine they would. And at the same time as we say that, at a kind of societal level, we talk about an epidemic of depression and we put masses of money into developing new drugs. And it's well established that people living in areas of high deprivation are massively overusing psychiatric drugs compared to people in more affluent parts of the country. So we see it and then we somehow hide it from ourselves. And to be fair, it's not always easy to make these links, because it's not just the diagnosis that stops us doing that, making those links. There are many, many ways in which the link between threats and threat responses can be obscured. So, for example, the operation of power might be kind of quite subtle and cumulative over time. It may have happened a long time ago. There may be so many threats that it's really hard to work out what's going on and how the threats relate to the threat responses. The threat responses may each individually seem quite minor, but actually there may be an awful lot of them. The threat response may take an unusual form. We may see people with very unusual beliefs, who hear voices that say things that the rest of us can't hear, who may use extreme forms of self-harm and so on. And of course, the person themselves may not be aware of the links. They may have deeply hidden memories that are too painful to carry in consciousness. And of course, it may be too shameful or frightening to tell people what has happened. And most importantly, as we've already said, mental health professionals are actually trained, all of them, whatever their background, and this also goes to quite a large extent for our own profession, clinical psychology, to obscure the links by applying diagnoses which impose a powerful expert narrative of individual deficit and illness. So why do they do that? Well, they do it in good faith as individual practitioners, but actually we would argue they're part of a much wider system in which there's huge resistance to recognising the reality, the widespread reality of the negative impact of power in people's lives, and there are many, many, many vested interests in keeping it that way. So, as I would see it, the core role of any mental health professional is to put back the links between threats and threat responses. It's not an easy task. It can take months, sometimes years, but it needs to happen. It rarely does. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples of what it looks like when we do disconnect threat responses, which we do all the time in service and as a society. We've no doubt seen a lot of these headlines everywhere about mental health services must be boosted to deal with a tsunami of cases after lockdown. This was 3 years ago now. So lots and lots of calls for massive increase in mental health resources as a result of lockdown. It appears that not only were we unfortunate enough to face an epidemic of a deadly virus, it was followed hot on its heels by an epidemic of mental health problems. Very bad luck to have two epidemics, one after another, or could there be a link? So if you actually look at what the research says, what it shows is that the people who are most likely to suffer from so-called mental health problems after lockdown were people whose lives were most difficult. They were older people in poor health and isolated, they were burnt out frontline professionals, they were women stuck at home juggling childcare with their jobs, there were people who are financially very insecure. And perhaps most importantly, we need to note that almost all minority ethnic groups had higher risks of dying from COVID than the white British majority of a comparable age. So what sense does it make to say they were actually suffering from an epidemic of mental health problems? I wrote an article suggesting we ought to put it another way. In ordinary language, people with more to be exhausted, depressed and anxious about are feeling more exhausted, depressed and anxious. It is not a pandemic of mental health problems we need to fear, but a pandemic of mental health thinking. So I wouldn't want to argue that we don't need more mental health resources, staff and money and facilities and so on, but to pose that as the simple and the only and the apparently obvious solution to what COVID actually showed us, which was to massively expose the horrendous degree of inequality in our society, is at the very least, I think, misunderstanding what's going on. And you could argue from some perspective that's a purposeful misunderstanding. Okay, I'm going to show you another example of disconnecting threat responses from threats. Here's some research that came out last year which shows, rather worryingly, that among 17 to 19-year-olds in England, 1 in 4 are said to have a probable mental disorder. If you look a bit more closely at what the research said, it said that the young people who were said to have a probable mental health disorder were much more likely to have been bullied, to feel unsafe in school, to lack friends, be worried about exams, be living in a family that couldn't afford to buy enough food, had fallen behind with the rent, couldn't afford to keep the house warm. So these young people were genuinely suffering, and they were genuinely suffering for very real reasons. I don't think it makes a great deal of sense to say not only are you being bullied at school and looking at your anxious parents who can't even afford to keep the house warm, you now have developed a mental health problem. I don't think that's a helpful way of looking at it. So I think we can see that the concept of mental health disorder is in some ways not a lot worse than the concept of a mental health problem. I mean, we use the language of mental health because it's almost impossible to get away from it. But actually this mysterious entity that intervenes between the difficult situation and the way people feel about it, I think, is another more subtle but just as unhelpful way of disconnecting threat from threat responses. We are told permanently we need to talk more about our mental health. I would suggest a subtle but important difference. We actually need to talk more about our feelings, because if we talk about our feelings, I feel so desperate, we are much more inclined to say, oh goodness, what's going on? If we translate that into, I have an anxiety disorder, that tends to lead us down a very different path. I'm going to talk about a couple of slightly different aspects of the framework. This aspect is what we have called general patterns within the power threat meaning framework. So one of the tasks we set ourselves when we were putting together the framework, and I wouldn't like to say we've completely achieved this, the whole project is, it's an ongoing process of development, it's imperfect in many ways, and we very much welcome other people's ideas and feedback, which we are incorporating into further development of the framework. But one of the questions we were faced with was, well, if the patterns that actually work quite well in general medicine to help us diagnose people, patterns that are things like diabetes is based on our medical knowledge about the pancreas and the production of insulin and so on. That's a medical pattern that leads us to a particular diagnosis, which is essential in setting out the right treatment. If we're saying that kind of pattern doesn't exist in psychiatry, the equivalents that are suggested to us, the low serotonin causes your depression, have not been confirmed by evidence. What kind of pattern do we need to look for instead? What kind of pattern is appropriate for understanding what goes wrong in our lives as opposed to what goes wrong with our bodies? And really this follows on a little bit from what I've already been saying. People create common narratives about their distress. A woman who's surviving rape or sexual abuse is very likely to create a set of meanings and narratives about that, which is to some extent individual, but also has quite a lot with other women in the same situation, to take one example. So the kinds of patterns that we developed as much more appropriate for understanding human emotional suffering, as opposed to what goes wrong in our bodies, are based on meaning. They are meta-narratives, if you like. They're bigger narratives that work at the level of a whole society, that both support and are supported by the individual narratives. You can't completely separate them. They feed into each other. So this, we hope, will help us to make the leap that is necessary to get right away from diagnostic thinking. We're thinking in broad terms about very different patterns or types of regularity that are much more appropriate for helping us to think about emotional distress. And if these patterns are shaped by meaning, a number of important things follow, like there's never going to be simple cause-effect links. It's never going to be the case that person X who experienced Y will have threat response Z, because in between that is the person's meaning-making, which will shape their response in all sorts of ways. It also follows that there can be no universal classification of so-called mental disorders. Every society, every culture will have its different kind of meanings. And it also follows that these patterns will constantly be evolving and changing because meanings change, societies change, cultures change. So our not very catchy phrase is patterns of embodied meaning-based threat responses to the negative operation of power. Essentially, we are saying that patterns describe not conditions you have, but at some level what people are doing in order to survive threats and abuses of power. Our aim is not to assign people to patterns. It's not a new way of putting people in categories. It's not a way of saying you have a bad case of pattern number 3 or whatever. It is a way of saying there may be a number of narratives in the case of any individual person that may help them to reflect from a slightly wider angle on their own particular story and may help us to understand where their particular story arose from. And we hope that these patterns can serve some of the functions that are sometimes said to be given by diagnosis, which is the feeling of it's not all my fault. Well, if you can trace things back in a power threat meaning sense, you can clearly see it's not all your fault. And it's not just me. Patterns, by definition, show that it's not just you. So this is a tiny, tiny extract from one of the patterns we've recently developed. It's about the experience of surviving poverty. These patterns are based on a great deal of evidence. We've cited the evidence. Don't need to read all that, but as you won't be surprised to hear, there are common, but of course not universal aspects to surviving poverty in terms of the things you are less able to do, in terms of the areas of your life that are threatened, in terms of the meanings that you may develop about your life, and in terms of the threat responses you may use to survive. So I hope you can see that might be useful both to a particular person who was struggling and also might be useful at, let's say, a public health level. We're pleased to say the starting to be some interest from a public health perspective about, you know, if, for example, we want to tackle misuse of alcohol, and if we discover that misuse of alcohol is much more common in people living in poverty, it's probably not going to be helpful just to have a campaign saying alcohol isn't good for you. People know that. We need to understand that people may be using that as one of the few threat responses available to them. Okay, I'm going to briefly touch on another angle. I'm keeping an eye on the time and I think I'm on schedule. Okay, but again, it's very brief. I can only hope to give you a flavour, really. So I want to talk a little bit about the consequences of diagnostic approaches for minority ethnic groups within and beyond the UK and for non-Western cultures. One of the least helpful aspects of DSM and ICD of diagnostic understandings, it seems to us, is the way that these failed models are being exported across the globe to other countries and cultures, which very often have ways of understanding distress, which work very well in context. And actually, I would argue, we don't have anything better to offer. Psychiatrists like Suman and Fernando argue this is simply another form of colonialism, less obvious but just as damaging. In contrast, the framework encourages us to respect and learn from local indigenous ways of expressing and healing distress, which interestingly are often narrative-based and community-based. So we want to go well beyond the traditional, the research that is being incorporated into practice to at least some extent, the particular adversities and abuses in people's lives that we now pay, I think, more attention to than we used to, but we still don't pay enough attention to these more distant factors like histories of colonisation, transgenerational trauma, loss of identity, culture, heritage and land, which can apply to whole peoples, particularly indigenous peoples, and to the culture-specific ways that people have come to terms or tried to come to terms with some of those extraordinarily difficult situations, and to respect and understand and learn from them rather than seek to impose our own Western perspective. So one of the more fascinating experiences I've had since the framework came out is I did a tour of Australia and New Zealand, and in Auckland I did a 2-day workshop alongside Indigenous people. The Māori are the Indigenous people of New Zealand, as you will know, and we did a fascinating compare and contrast kind of exercise where I presented the framework on the first day, and we had a very, very different presentation of Māori understandings of distress on the second day, which of course are totally different from my rather PowerPoint-heavy presentation on the first day. They were explained in terms of singing and sharing stories. They're about the Sky Father and the Earth Mother and the gods and how they interact and their conflicts and their difficulties and their triumphs and their failures, and a Māori understanding of distress and a Māori way of healing and expressing that would take place in a community setting where you would collectively explore those legends in order to see if it had meaning for the present situation. And interestingly enough, in New Zealand, there are clinics where you can go and have a Māori understanding of distress, not a Western one. And I met a Māori psychiatrist who told me, in a way that I found quite, I was very, very pleased to hear that the existence of the framework had supported her argument to set up clinics based on Māori understandings. Not that she is using the framework in her clinic, and nor is that our intention. We're not about exporting the framework, but we are about having a way of understanding distress that allows us mutual respect and learning from other countries and cultures. As she herself said, the PTMF is a kind of distant cousin. Okay, so since 2018, a lot has happened. The framework was published in 2018. Much to our absolute astonishment, there's been interest across the UK and from many other countries. I've done a lot of travelling since 2018. We've collectively, there's a group of us, a committee that offers training and on the spot and by Zoom and in various different settings. There are a number of translations in progress. There has been interest from mental health services of all brands, child, adult, older adult, intellectual disabilities and so on, from the criminal justice system, from training courses, from education, from various therapeutic approaches. and there's been controversy, which we may have time to talk about afterwards. Please visit the website if any of this is any interest to you. The documents are there for free. There are examples of good practice. There are podcasts. There are interviews. There's everything that you might want to find out about to follow up anything that either of us have said. So that's fantastic. I think it shows a widespread recognition that what we're doing is not working. We need something different. We're not claiming that we have the perfect something different, but clearly we're not the only people saying we do need something very different. Okay, so I'm going to give you very, very brief examples of some of what this looks like in practice. So this is, again, you can read this on the website and I'll give you a link to follow up. This is some wards in central and northwest London, inpatient wards not far from here, which in 2017 were stuck in a very diagnostic medical perspective with low staff morale and high rates of seclusion and restraint, and everybody feeling that they weren't offering or being offered the service that ideally they needed. They've undergone a complex long-term project which is still in progress, but part of it is that they have adopted the framework so that in weekly meetings they can consider people's stories from a PTMF perspective, not from a diagnostic perspective. So you can see on the right-hand side what the meeting looks like in terms of its structure. On the left-hand side are the questions that they consider in the meeting. And the idea obviously is to come up with a narrative that makes more sense of someone's difficulties and that may offer new and different ways forward. So, after 4 years, the changes are dramatic. Self-harm, 90% reduction in self-harm incidents, significant reduction in the use of restraint and seclusion, staff reporting increased compassion and understanding and skills, service users saying the approach has been much, much more helpful to them. Very hard work on behalf of the staff has achieved that, I have to say. It's an ongoing project now being rolled out to a number of other services. I'm aware of at least 6 or 7 other services that are interested in taking this on, which is fab. There's the link to the article. This is proper evidence. It's in a peer-reviewed journal, so it must be true. And interestingly, we've become almost respectable. This project and the framework are recommended by NHS England's recent guidance on best practice in acute inpatient care. Okay, and very, very differently, I'm going to just show you a couple of slides from some peer groups, that is, groups of people who've been on the receiving end of psychiatric interventions and who meet regularly without professional support to try and think about different ways forward. So this is an article by Amanda Griffiths, which you can read on the website, who introduced the framework to her peer group, and they spent a week discussing each of the main questions. It's a really great article. I recommend you read it, and we're delighted that Amanda is now one of our regular trainers. What she said is, what I didn't expect was the framework would empower me to reclaim my selfhood as I began the life-changing process of transforming from a service user labelled with a personality disorder to become a strong, independent survivor taking control of my life. Not everyone will want to do that, but for those who do, the framework offers a possible way forward. I'm going to briefly show you an extract of another woman who decided to think about her own story from a PTMF perspective. Her whole story is on the website. She's generously allowed us to share it. She's a particularly articulate person, and not all stories have to appear in this form. They don't have to be written. They can appear in all sorts of forms, but nevertheless, hers is a very good example, I think. She is a young woman who had a long history of what we usually call anorexia, and her story describes how this can be situated in her context, which was a complex one of, firstly, domestic violence in the home, secondly, kind of religious Catholic messages in this case, which were unhelpful to her, and thirdly, really quite rigid gender role stereotypes. Her mother, herself, and the messages she took on about women and their roles and their bodies and how they should behave and how they should look and so on. So, if I let you read the first paragraph, I might read the second paragraph out because I think it's a particularly moving one. So she has telling herself and is telling others a very different story. So she says, I think the final piece of resistance for me involves finally telling my story, telling it, validating it, daring to speak it, daring to use the words, daring to sit in a room and look at it, taking risk after risk. I hope I'm finding a space to tell mine, slowly, haltingly, but telling it, in words and pictures and silences. And she quotes, liberation is always in part a storytelling process, breaking stories, breaking silences, making new stories. A free person tells her own story. A valued person lives in a society in which her story has a place. I can't think of a better way of summing up the aims of the framework. And we urgently need change. This is my next but last slide. Last month, a study in a well-known psychiatric journal found that over 80% of the Danish population will be treated for mental illness at some point of their life, and that subsequently they were more likely to become unemployed, receive a benefit, earn lower income, to be living alone, to be unmarried. So nearly all of us, at least if we continue on the current trajectory, are or will be mentally ill. The commentator on this article says, does this mean that the search for biological differences between the mentally ill and the normal can now be called off, since it appears that basically everyone is mentally ill? And I think this does raise the question, which is a very pertinent one posed by the PTMF, what can we say about societies which seem to be driving everyone mad and keeping them that way? The current system is not working, it absolutely isn't working. And we hope that the framework offers at least some different ways of putting back the links that Mary described right at the beginning as being separated, putting back our stories, putting back the context, encouraging us to create different stories about our lives, reclaiming our experience in order to take back authorship of our own stories because of the restorative power of truth-telling. More information for anyone who wants it. The yellow book, which is on sale to lucky 6 people who rush forward waving 15 quid at me, is the most accessible way into the framework and will take you, if you're interested, step by step through the process of constructing a PTMF narrative on your own or with someone you're working with or supporting. Thank you very much.
So thank you. I guess my question relates to addiction, because I think that's a space that's suffered quite a lot from the medical disease model that's currently in place. And yeah, I guess my question with that is, the way I see this model is that it's very insights-based. How do you have to make sure that it's being paired with behavioral interventions, CBT practices, to ensure that you're seeing improvements? So although the insights can help change the story, how does that manifest in changes in behavior, which I think would relate quite strongly to something like addiction?
Do you want to do that?
Okay, I'll kick off. There has been quite an interest from addiction services in the framework, so that's good. I don't think I would see the framework as necessarily depending on insight. I mean, it's not a therapy model, it's much, much bigger than that. So, I mean, as I'm sure you know, most people, or many people who are living with addiction have all sorts of other problems like housing and not having enough to live on and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I think it really implies we need to look at the whole picture, which you might or might not involve some kind of insight and some kind of story. The stories we currently tell about addiction, I think, are very unhelpful, and they seem to me to be a mixture of the shaming story, it's your fault and why are you so weak-willed, and the medical story, it's not your fault at all, it's an illness. Now, neither of those are particularly helpful, and I hope the framework might offer a way in between that allows, addiction is another threat response, if you like. People turn to substances when their lives are desperate and overwhelming and when they don't have other ways of dealing with their pain. I recommend a book by Johan Hari, H-A-R-I, Chasing the Scream. Chasing the Scream is a good book, and Gabor Mate is good on this as well, M-A-T-E. Do you want to add anything to that, Mary?
Yeah, I think I would just add that it also, looking at addiction from a framework perspective, also helps us to think about the relationship of the body and behaviour as well, because you have to take into account the huge bodily effect of addictive substances. And so I think it can offer a way of thinking about both what is it in your life that has helped, that has perhaps led you to this in the first place, but also what is it about both your life and the substances that is making it difficult to stop, and so to think of a way through that. The framework, as we've said, and we do want to emphasize this, it is not a form of therapy. It is not a therapeutic manual or guide. It is a way of thinking that is compatible with quite a lot of therapeutic approaches, but not a diagnostic or medical or individualistic one.
Thanks so much for the talk. That was really insightful. I'm wondering, how would this framework help change the relationship with power for individuals? And what does that mean to social change, resistance, and politics?
Can you tell me what she said?
I didn't quite hear that. Sorry. But I've put up a slide which I haven't showed you, which I think may be relevant.
So I'm wondering, how would the framework change individuals' relationship with power, since power is such a central point for the framework? And what's the implication for social change, resistance, and politics?
If I start from the individual, I think in the framework we try to take a position that is neither unrealistic. You can seize back power in all areas of your life and everything be fine, nor completely hopeless. There are so many power forces around me, there's nothing I can do about it. And interesting, we've been accused of taking both extremes. You're a helpless victim of capitalism versus you should pull your socks up. And we're saying neither of those things. But we are saying, I hope, that stories that locate your own experiences within a wider power context can, at least to some extent, empower people to a greater degree, whereas diagnostic approaches, we would say, overall and on average tend to disempower people. So I've put that quote up, which you can read if you want. This is from another peer group that use the framework, and it describes, I think, very vividly what it feels like to see things you hadn't seen before and to realise the impact of power in your life, and how that can be both painful but also, in the best sense of the word, empowering. But the social change bit is the other angle of this, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. I think I would like to say that one of the things that has perhaps slightly surprised us, we knew that power was important in people's lives, but we have been a little bit surprised and gratified by how quickly people have taken the idea of power and applied it to their own lives and told us how very, very helpful that has been. One of the things that happens in mental health services is that people are offered a really unhelpful dichotomy. They're told, we've called it the brain or blame dichotomy. You're told there's something wrong with your brain or it's your fault. And so quite often people say, when I got a diagnosis, I knew it meant it wasn't my fault. It wasn't a lifestyle choice. It didn't mean that I was irresponsible or weak-willed. And so it's a really unfortunate choice to give people. And once you introduce the idea of power and power processes and meaning and how threat responses are, bring all that together, people do start to look at their lives very differently. And then I think talking about it for social change, we've pointed out quite often in the framework and talking about the framework that social activism is one of the best healers. No, it doesn't mean everyone has to do it, but if you do it, it tends to be really very, very healing for people. And that's why we've been so strong on this question of what are your strengths, because people often underestimate their strengths. They think about them as inner qualities rather than thinking about what access to power do I have in my life, or how can I be enabled, or how can someone help me to gain those accesses. So I think that would be something I would say for social change, is to help people think in those ways.
It's such an important question about social change, because in a way, if you trace anyone's story back far enough, it seems to me that you almost inevitably get to the need for social change. Well, so what do you do about that? Well, I mean, as the framework cannot possibly bring about the revolution, but I think what we would say, I hope, is that before anything can happen, we need to see the problem. We need to join the links. We need to see how power is operating. We need to see how social change is needed. We need to see what is at the root of all these difficulties. You know, we can't claim to be doing more than that, but I think that's an absolutely essential first step. I think that's what I'd say to that. Very complex and interesting question. And of course, any attempt to change fundamental things, including the psychiatric system, meets resistance. We've had plenty of that. If the framework went a bit further, I suspect we meet a whole lot more resistance from perhaps different quarters.
First of all, thank you for the lecture. My question is more about the clinical application of the power threat meaning framework, particularly within a very kind of resource-deprived NHS. My understanding of the power threat meaning framework is that it's quite similar to like a meaning-making kind of formulation, and building this robust formulation can take time, especially if we're not able to get the history of the client, or if the client's not able to make that links between the power and the threat responses. How can you see the application of the power threat meaning framework, especially in wards that are so busy? So I'm actually quite interested to hear a little bit more about how that case study within the Central and North West London ward was like, to just get a little bit more of understanding of practically what that looks like.
You use the magic word formulation. Are you a psychologist? Are you one of us? I thought you might be. Should I start it? Yes. So, I mean, very briefly, for those in the audience who are not lucky enough to be clinical psychologists, a formulation is a kind of a professional version of constructing or co-constructing a narrative, which all psychologists are trained in. And in the framework, we very deliberately haven't made it about formulation as such, but formulation is a subset of the wider group of narratives. It's a kind of narrative which has got quite a foothold in services in the UK. Interestingly, it's almost unique to the UK. So your question is about, you know, is it long and complicated to put together a narrative of any kind? If you want to read more about the CNW project, do follow that link. They described it in some detail, but I mean, I think what I would say is two things. One, it's always more effective in the long run, gives you better use of resources and cheaper to give people the help they need, which can only be based on a proper understanding of what their problems are. And two, that a formulation doesn't have to be an all-singing, dancing one. And actually, any kind of conversation that starts with tell me what's going on with you and tell me a bit about your life, as opposed to what are your symptoms, is a beginning of the process of formulating. It doesn't take any longer than saying what are your symptoms, here's this checklist, can be built on, is likely to take you down a very different and I would say more productive path.
Yeah, I'd just add to that it can be very gratifying and quite surprising once people are given the beginnings of a different way of thinking, how quickly they can then access all kinds of things in their own lives which take that forward. I mean, I'm sure Lucy can say this too, but I have certainly seen people where you have an hour's conversation with them about possible different ways, and the next time you see them, they've said, oh, I've done this, I went, and it's just a kind of change in outlook which can lead to all sorts of things. I mean, one of the things about a diagnostic approach is that it can tend to give a sense of helplessness. And one of the other things that we find talking to people is that if you tell people they've got a vulnerability to a mental disorder, biological, and that may be triggered by various events, then they become very anxious about those triggers. And they see themselves that, oh, this will just get at me. Like the thing I was saying at the beginning, it's like you're an object acted on by these forces. Whereas if you give people a much more relational and social and active way of looking at it, it can help them to be actually less anxious and see that they can do things they might not have thought possible before.
Yeah, just ask you a difficult question. Just kind of picking up a bit from one of the earlier questions, because I guess the strategy that's been followed so far is really to get the framework out amongst kind of practitioners and psychologists and service users. But I guess in terms of changing government policy, there needs to be something kind of broader, across the general public and also policymakers. And I was just thinking that the argument that you're making is very similar also to the kind of work of, the Marmot Commission and the Marmot Report in terms of inequalities in physical health. And we've just had governments ignoring, the fact that they've been warning for years about the links between inequality and physical health. We know also the links between inequality and mental health. And yet governments kind of ignore that. The inequalities are getting worse, physical health and mental health problems are getting worse. So how do we move forward, really? And also when we look at kind of surveys of the general population think health is, again, an individual matter. And when people think, how do we solve health problems, it's invest in the NHS. Well, the NHS doesn't control wage policy, doesn't control education, doesn't control all the things that cause these inequalities. So it's an impossible question to ask you, really. But how do we persuade the general public of these kinds of arguments? How do we get these arguments out there, outside of the kind of mental health ghetto? And how do we persuade politicians? Because really, there's nothing in it for them, is there? Because they then got to try and address inequality rather than say, we'll give more money to mental disorders. So
I don't know about politicians, because that's quite difficult, but I mean, both of us have done various presentations along policy lines. And one of the things that strikes me about it, which makes things very, very difficult, is that there are a lot of groups who are doing marvellous social projects, which are incredibly helpful to people with mental health problems, but they are ultimately stuck in a medical approach, because what happens is people talk about the social determinants of health, i.e. things like good diet so you don't get diabetes or the problems with obesity, you don't smoke so you don't get respiratory disorders, and they look at, and this phrase, mental health, in the same way, that you have social determinants which make people ill. And so they're absolutely stuck when they get to the medical model. So for me, the first thing is to try and help people to see that our emotional problems, our behavioural difficulties are not the same at all as the kind of physical problems that also have social determinants. It's not the same process. And that, for me, is a big sticking point. And I'm not quite sure how to get round. I have to say, because I've seen it in operation so much, and politicians even, or policymakers who are very keen, somehow get stuck. Oh yes, and once we get a diagnosis and an illness, then, and so we have to just keep, and I would like to stop using the language of mental health. I think that has been a real step backwards. So I'm not sure, but I do know I think that has to be the starting point.
Mm. I mean, as you say, there's no answer to it, Dave. Dave is one of the co-authors of the framework, so he knows all about its limitations. We had a kind of small victory recently, as you may remember. So Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett are very distinguished epidemiologists, as you know, whose very influential book, The Spirit Level, showed beyond any possible doubt how inequality of income in any given society massively increases the risk of all sorts of undesirable consequences, including what they then called mental illness. And I've got to know Richard and Kate a bit, and they have now recanted on their vocabulary and are not using that terminology anymore. And Richard wrote a very nice blurb for the Yellow Book. So, you know, they're influential people, and it's quite interesting to me how, you know, I wonder if Michael Marmot might have the same kind of openness to a discussion. You know, it's the same things we were saying before. If you have these conversations with people, it's sometimes quite surprising how, yes, they see it, and all we can do is keep plugging away, I guess.
Thank you, that was really interesting. So I wanted to ask how far you want to replace the notion of disordered behaviours and whether you want to replace it with anything. So if we want to get rid of the notion of mental disorder, then we want to replace it, as I understand it, with something like misfiring threat responses. So you have threat responses, and it seems like sometimes they're really rational. And again, I'm probably falling into the framework of mental health, but it does seem like sometimes that power imbalance kind of gone away. So sometimes it might be societal, it might remain, but sometimes it might be an agent, and then that agent is no longer there, and then those threat responses are maybe preventing someone from living at a normal or good quality of life. So I was wondering whether you wanted to see those threat responses as misfiring, and whether there is an aim of the framework to sort of help with that, or whether that falls too far into the old framework.
I think we don't want to be as precise as that in a way. I mean, a threat response is not something misfiring, and you don't have to use that language. Trauma-informed practice uses the term survival responses, but you can use what you like. And I think what we're fundamentally wanting to say is that people's distress is understandable in context. It makes sense in context. It serves the function of helping people to survive in difficult situations, past and or present. I don't think we'd want to go further than that in a way. I mean, we're actually proposing something so different. I think it's sometimes hard to get your head around it, but we're not saying instead of calling it X, we call it Y. We're saying we need a fundamentally different way of thinking which will change everything, And the words, I think, are validating, listening, witnessing, understanding, rather than, do we call it a threat response or do we call it a survival response, or those are kind of secondary issues in a way, and I think those kind of questions answer themselves once you've created or co-created a narrative which makes sense to a particular person, perhaps a particular family, a particular community, and so on. Don't know if I've answered your question, but those are my immediate thoughts.
Yeah, maybe, can I just say something more about threat responses, which also links to what Dave was saying. The thing about threat responses that perhaps we haven't said a huge amount about this evening is that they are functional, and they are ways in which people try to meet their emotional, their relational, their bodily, their social needs under incredibly challenging circumstances. Now, we all try to meet those needs most of the time, but because we're often able to do it in ways that are socially acceptable because we have all kinds of resources to do it. And when people are in situations where they do not have those resources, in other words, where they're very disempowered, then they will still be trying to meet their needs, but in ways which other people will find socially unacceptable or maybe harmful to the person or to others. But once you get that picture, that the threat responses are ways of trying to meet your needs, emotional, psychological, relational, social, bodily, under duress, then it kind of changes everything, really. Because people will carry on trying to meet their needs in whatever ways they can. And once you understand that, if people have different ways of meeting their needs, then they will do it. But, they often don't have that available to them. And that's where power comes in as well, because the less power you have, the more likely you are to try and meet your needs in ways that other people find socially unacceptable and will get you labelled as mad or mentally ill.
Lots to think about, and lots to think about in all your questions, so thank you.